Welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. The Bible tells one big story of redemption, and we want to spend 5 minutes every day journeying through the Bible from start to finish and exploring how all of it points to Jesus.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Crystal, and in today's episode, we will be discussing the minor prophets. In our last bonus episode, Kristen talked all about dreams and visions in the prophets, and so if you haven't listened to that, go check it out. So she technically covered Hosea in her episode, but I'm going to overlap as we will be covering the minor prophets. If someone were to ask you what the minor prophets were all about, what would you say? Sure, we just read them in rapid succession, so we have the details, but sometimes we are still left with a lot of questions. It can feel like a lot to keep up with. The writings of the minor prophets were recorded over a few hundred years, and they prophesied generally during the times of Kings and Chronicles. So it could be helpful to place the prophet within its historical context when possible. Study Bibles and even resources like the Bible Handbook from the Daily Grace Co. will give you all of that information. So let's chat about some important things for us to remember anytime we are reading one of the prophets. In order for us to do that, we need to go all the way back to Genesis. Yes, all the way back. In Genesis 12, verse 2, God tells Abram, "I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you, I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing." And he says in verse 3 that all the nations will be blessed through Abram. God intends to use Abram and his descendants, the people of Israel, to be a blessing to other nations. Israel is to reflect God to the people around them. But as you've read, the people of God have failed to live up to the standards that God has set for them. So with that context, let's talk about some things that are going to help us to better understand the prophets. First, along with the major prophets, the minor prophets are primarily concerned with the same thing: God's faithfulness to his covenantal promises and the unfaithfulness displayed in his people. Though the minor prophets are separate books in our Bibles, there is cohesion and unifying themes as we read. The prophets were called by God to proclaim his message to his people, the Israelites. Their aim in preaching this message was to bring God's people back into a right relationship with God by renouncing false gods and idols and instead turning to worship the one true God, Yahweh. As we consider the messages of the prophets, we keep Genesis 12, 2-3 in mind. The prophets recognize that the people have failed to worship God and they failed to be a blessing to the nations. So the prophets pronounce judgment upon God's people because of their disobedience. But these oracles of judgment are not just limited to Israel and Judah. They also address the foreign pagan nations. And this might seem strange, yet these foreign nations also did not worship Yahweh, and they instead worshiped idols. So Israel was actually guilty of acting like these pagan nations. And both Israel and these nations would come under God's judgment if they did not turn from their wicked ways. Which leads us to the second thing for us to remember. The prophets are drawing on the past to reveal what will happen to God's people if they do not change course, the consequences already set before them for their disobedience. For years, I did not understand the prophets. I thought they were these mysterious figures that could look into the future almost like a crystal ball. And don't get me wrong, the prophets obviously accurately predict future events. But as we read the prophets in view of the Old Testament, we see that they are really pointing back to the warnings that God had already laid out for his people if they did not walk in his ways. In Deuteronomy 28, Moses lays out the blessings for obedience and the curses for disobedience. In that chapter, you will recognize many of the things the prophets warned Israel of, including exile and the horrific pain that they would endure at the hands of enemy nations. Many commentaries describe the prophets as an alarm clock, warning the people that there is impending judgment for those who do not turn back to the Lord. But sadly, many ignored the alarm and continued in their slumber of rebellion being sent into exile as a result. It can feel hopeless for us to read about God's judgment for several days in a row, but we see glimmers of hope even in the darkest of passages. The final book of the Old Testament prophets is the book of Malachi. In it, we see one of those glimmers of hope. In Malachi 3:1, it says, "See, I am going to send my messenger, and he will clear the way before me. Then the Lord you seek will suddenly come to his temple, the messenger of the covenant you delight in. See, he is coming, says the Lord of armies." So as we open the book of Matthew tomorrow, remember the words of the Old Testament. Keep them in view as you reflect on the faithfulness of our covenant-keeping God. As we read in Malachi, there is a promised hope, and that hope will be fulfilled. First in John the Baptist as the messenger who clears the way, and then most importantly, it is fulfilled in the Lord himself, the messenger of the covenant who enters into this broken world. Just as the prophets pointed to the faithfulness of God to the Israelites, we will see his faithfulness continue to unfold as a baby is born in Bethlehem. This wraps up our bonus episode for the Minor Prophets. As always, it is such a joy to be with you today. You can find more information about the Daily Grace Co. at thedailygraceco.com or on our Instagram at thedailygraceco. Thanks so much for listening, and we will be in the book of Matthew with you tomorrow.